Welcome to Portraits of the Past, where we explore the lives of those whose legacies continue to echo through time. They came for the Jews of France at dawn, not in ones and twos, not through the slow accumulation of individual accusations and local pressures. On the 22nd of July, 1306, in a single coordinated operation across the whole of the kingdom, the same sealed order mechanism, the same simultaneous execution, the same administrative precision that Philip IV applied to every problem large enough to require it. Royal officers arrested every Jewish man, woman, and child they could find. Their property was seized. Their homes and synagogues were inventoried. The debts owed to them, the long ledgers of credit extended across decades of commerce, were not cancelled. They were redirected. The debtors would still pay. They would pay the crown. By nightfall, a community that had existed in France for centuries was dispossessed, imprisoned pending expulsion, and converted into a revenue stream for the man who had just destroyed it. In part one of this portrait, we met the machine Philip IV of France had spent a decade building. The centralized royal bureaucracy staffed by trained Roman lawyers, the legistes, whose understanding of institutional power translated the king's will into legal process with a precision the feudal world had not previously encountered. We met Guillaume de Nogaret, the instrument Philip had placed at the center of that apparatus, and we watched the first collision take shape. Two institutions, the French monarchy and the medieval papacy, arriving at the same jurisdictional boundary from opposite directions, their incompatible claims temporarily papered over in diplomatic language that could not hold. Part one ended with a bishop under arrest and a pope in Rome composing his response. But to understand what Philip IV actually was, what kind of king, what kind of mind, you cannot study only the confrontations that produced dramatic scenes. You have to study the methods, and the methods are most visible not in the great theatrical clash with Boniface VIII, but in the quieter operations that preceded it and ran alongside it. The systematic financial warfare Philip waged against every population within his reach that he could destroy with law. The problem was money. It was always money. Philip had inherited a kingdom powerful enough to pursue ambitious foreign policy, but not rich enough on its conventional tax base to sustain it. The war with England over Gascony, which began in earnest in 1294, was the immediate crisis. The campaigns demanded resources the feudal dues and domain income could not supply, and it was in direct response to that pressure that Philip reached for the instruments he would refine across the rest of his reign. The coin debasements began in 1295. The extractions from the Italian banking families operating across France began their most aggressive phase in the same decade. The methods were not improvised under duress. They were developed, tested, and systematized during the Gascon War. And then the Flanders campaigns came and the catastrophic French defeat at Courtrai in 1302, where Flemish infantry killed some of the finest cavalry in Europe and hung their golden spurs on the church walls, and the methodology already in place was simply applied at greater scale. This is essential to understand. Philip did not reach for increasingly ruthless financial instruments because he was running out of options. He had built the instruments before the worst of the disasters arrived. What the disasters did was remove any remaining inhibition about deploying them. The first instrument was the coinage itself, and its logic was as old as royal minting. By reducing the silver content of French currency, issuing coin that carried the same nominal value but was physically worth less, Philip extracted wealth from every transaction in the kingdom. Debts contracted in heavier coin could be repaid in lighter. The crown's own obligations shrank in real terms. The costs were distributed invisibly across the entire population through the inflation that followed. His subjects were not fooled. The chroniclers who recorded the reign preserved a designation for Philip that circulated among those who understood what was happening: faux monnayeur, the counterfeiter king. The nickname reached him. He adjusted the rate and continued. When he attempted to restore stronger coinage in 1306, a reversal that created immediate hardship for those who had borrowed in lighter coin and now faced repayment demands in heavier, the resulting fury in Paris produced riots severe enough that Philip was forced to take shelter inside the Paris Temple. The great fortress residence of the Knights Templar stood on the right bank of the Seine, its walls thick and its garrison sufficient to hold a mob at bay. He sheltered with the Templars. He sheltered with the men he would destroy 2 years later. But debasing the currency was a blunt instrument. Its costs were visible, distributed, and politically dangerous. What Philip needed was targeted liquid wealth, populations that had accumulated it in forms that could be seized, whose legal standing was sufficiently precarious to make seizure answerable to a sufficiently well-constructed argument. He found it first in the Italian merchant banking families operating across France. Known collectively, if imprecisely, as the Lombards, they had financed European commerce and royal ambition for generations. They were wealthy, mobile, and crucially foreign. They held no noble standing within France, no ancestral claim on the protections that a domestic lord might invoke, and they were deeply embedded in the financial machinery of the French crown itself, which had borrowed from them extensively, a relationship that created for a king with Philip's particular cast of mind an obvious incentive. The campaign against the Italian bankers was not a single dramatic stroke. It was sustained pressure applied across the 1290s and into the following decade. Fines, forced loans, expulsion orders, the seizure of assets. Each operation followed the same sequence: identify the legal vulnerability, construct the authorization, deploy the apparatus. The debts the crown owed to Lombard creditors became, in the logic of the operation, part of the yield. You could not collect from a creditor you had expelled. The crown's obligations, like the wealth itself, simply absorbed into the machinery. The technique worked. It generated revenue. It eliminated creditors. And it pointed with the insistent logic of a methodology proving its own validity toward a larger target. It is important to say clearly, Philip IV did not invent what he was doing to the Jews of France. His great-grandfather, Philip II Augustus, had expelled the Jews from the royal domain in 1182, seizing their property and redirecting the debts owed to them to the crown. The same mechanism applied to a smaller territorial scale. Louis IX, Philip IV's grandfather, had subjected the Jewish community to severe and systematic persecution. Philip III, his father, had continued the pattern of exploitation and constraint. What Philip IV inherited was not a novel idea, it was a template, a Capetian tradition of identifying the Jewish community as a population whose legal vulnerability made it available for periodic destruction and financial absorption. What Philip IV brought to that tradition was the machine he had spent 20 years building, the administrative apparatus that could execute a coordinated, simultaneous, kingdom-wide operation on a single day. Something no French king before him had possessed the institutional reach to attempt. The 1306 expulsion was forensic. It was not spontaneous religious hysteria, not an ideological purge driven by the anti-Jewish preaching that had convulsed other parts of Europe in that era. The simultaneity of the arrests, every Jewish household in France reached on the same morning, by officers acting on sealed orders prepared months in advance, required the kind of administrative preparation that left traces in the royal records. It was planned with the same cold precision Philip brought to military campaigns, treaty negotiations, and the management of the papacy. The community that had lived under French royal authority for centuries, paying its tallages and managing its constrained existence within the boundaries that authority set, had become, in the Crown's assessment, more valuable liquidated than maintained. The financial logic was exact. When the Jews were expelled, the debts they held did not disappear. Philip claimed them. The debtors, who had owed money to Jewish creditors and might reasonably have hoped that expulsion meant cancellation, found royal agents arriving to collect in the Crown's name. The creditors who had spent years building those portfolios were gone. The king collected. What Philip had constructed across 3 targets of escalating complexity was a repeatable institutional procedure. Identify a legally vulnerable population holding liquid wealth, build the authorizing argument, execute simultaneously at scale, absorb the proceeds. The Capetian tradition provided the concept, the legistes provided the legal architecture, the administrative machine provided the execution. Philip provided the will and the patience to combine all 3 into something that operated with the cold efficiency of a managed process rather than the violence of a raid. And then he looked at the Knights Templar. The Templars were not simply wealthy. They were the institution that physically administered the French royal treasury. The Paris Temple served as the operational center of the kingdom's cash flow, its reserves managed by an order whose financial sophistication rivaled any banking house in Europe. Their wealth was vast, their properties scattered across France, their assets untaxed by virtue of the papal exemptions that placed them outside ordinary ecclesiastical and secular jurisdiction. They were, in the precise sense Philip's lawyers understood, legally complex, an institution whose standing depended on a specific configuration of papal authority and royal tolerance that had never been seriously tested. Philip owed them money. That much is documented, though the precise scale of the debt is disputed in the scholarship. But the financial threat the Templars represented was not primarily the debt. It was the wealth they held in reserve, the treasury they administered, the untaxed accumulation of 2 centuries of crusading endowment. and the fact that the same legal structure protecting them from ordinary taxation also protected them from the ordinary instruments of royal extraction. What Philip needed was an extraordinary instrument. What he had was nogaret, and 20 years of practice constructing arguments that opponents could not answer, and a methodology that had already proved it could destroy institutions far older and more deeply embedded than its targets had believed possible. By 1306, Philip was looking at the Templars the way he had learned to look at every large accumulation of wealth inside a legal structure he had not yet found the argument to dismantle. Patiently, without visible reaction, waiting for the argument to complete itself. He was looking for the argument. What history records? Joseph Strayer's biography, The Reign of Philip the Fair, the most comprehensive scholarly treatment of the reign in English, documents the financial operations of Philip's kingship across their full chronological range and consistently supports a reading of deliberate, developed method rather than reactive desperation. The coin debasements, Strayer demonstrates, were managed policy decisions, refined over time, not the blind improvisation of a treasury in crisis. William Chester Jordan's The French Monarchy and the Jews is the definitive scholarly treatment of the 1306 expulsion. Jordan establishes the administrative premeditation of the operation and documents the debt collection mechanism that followed, demonstrating that the expulsion was a financial operation with ideological cover, not an ideological act with financial consequences. The claim, common in popular history, that the Templars were the single largest creditor of the French crown at the time of their suppression is disputed by the serious scholarship, including Strayer. The more precise and more revealing truth is that the Templars administered the royal treasury and held reserves of untaxed wealth that Philip sought to absorb, a different kind of financial threat and a more complete one. The popular portrait of Philip IV as a king controlled by his ministers, Nogaret and his colleagues doing the real work while the king posed, does not survive serious engagement with the documentary record. Strayer, after exhaustive analysis, concludes that the decisions were Philip's. The ministers executed. The will that directed them was elsewhere. Where historians continue to disagree is on the relative weight of financial versus political motivation in specific operations, and on the precise sequencing of individual decisions. The motivations were almost certainly multiple and interlocking: financial urgency, the elimination of competing power centers, the extension of royal jurisdiction. The scholarship is honest about this complexity. Philip IV of France did not invent the exploitation of legally vulnerable populations. He inherited the template from his own ancestors and refined it across 3 decades with the tools his particular moment made available. What he demonstrated, and what the record of his reign makes very difficult to look away from, is how far that template can travel when it is given a sufficiently sophisticated institutional apparatus to operate through. The operations this episode has traced were scrupulously documented. Every seizure was authorized. Every expulsion moved through proper administrative channels. The paperwork was immaculate. The law, at every stage, said what Philip needed it to say. because Philip had spent 20 years employing the men whose purpose was to make it say that. That question, what distinguishes a legal instrument from a weapon dressed as one, is not a medieval question. It is not finished. And Philip IV of France, sitting in his characteristic stillness, his face communicating nothing of what moved behind it, is one of history's most precise illustrations of why it keeps being asked. The paint is dry on this chapter, but the archives are vast. Subscribe and return to portraits of the past. The next exhibit awaits.